Hello everyone, welcome back. Thanks for joining us. I'm Andrew Charlton. This is EUROCONTROL Aviation StraightTalk Live. This is the program that once upon a time used to look at what better might be when we built back to it, but nowadays tries to look at all of the issues that we have to face in the aviation industry. No issue is more important than sustainability. No issue is more important than being carbon neutral for this industry and for its licence to grow and to continue to grow. And no one is more informed and better able to talk to us about those subjects than William Todts, the Executive Director of Transport and Environment, a Brussels-based NGO that, as the name suggests, talks about transport and the environment, funnily enough. I'm looking forward to talking to William. I think it's a fascinating topic, but before we get into that, as ever at Straight Talk, I'd like to ask the Director General, Mr. Eamon Brennan, if he'd be so kind as to give us a recent update on what's happening in the market. Eamon.
Good afternoon, William and Andrew, and I really look forward to an interesting debate this afternoon. So before we start, I think it's worth looking at the price of jet fuel over the last year. We're now at 129% higher than we were just 1 year ago. And can you imagine the cost this has had on airline operating costs and on fares? So when you actually get down to the detail of how this is coming through to the market, it's worthwhile looking at the manifestation of it in booking. And it's very simple. There's basically been a 33% increase in airfares if you book them 14 days prior to departure. So we're looking at, in the short term, we can see an increase in fares, and in the long term, with the price of oil and the uncertainty of the Ukraine situation, all of this is pushing up fares, and this is going to cause a lot of difficulties going forward. Last week I was at IATA, and the common theme there was that airlines are still struggling to deal with their pandemic losses. They were looking at having a huge loss in 2021, again in 2022. But the interesting thing was that Europe are all in a loss-making situation, but the United States, they've managed to grind out a profit. And this just shows you the difference in the key markets there, in that there's a number of airlines there who have higher prices but are actually getting a return. In Europe, it's still pretty dismal, and you look at the red lines there in front of you, you can see that the price of oil, inflation in Europe, cost pressure, all of these things, and strikes, etc., are giving a rising increase in airfares and, of course, a reduction in profits. Our forecasts have been pretty consistent. We've been remarkably accurate. And if you just look at where we are, we're predicting 9.5 million flights this year, which is about 85% of 2019. We're currently running at 1% above our median forecast, but below the high and well above the low. So the next number of months are going to be really, really important. And what are we facing in the summer? Well, first of all, volumes are up, and that's the first thing. And you can see that the main airline groups, the four Ryanair, the KLM, Air France and Lufthansa, they're all increasing there as we go along. But with an exceptional performance by the low cost, and in particular Ryanair, who are exceeding 3,000 flights a day. It's the first ever in actual Europe to do this. So we're seeing a two-stage recovery, with the long haul struggling a little bit and the short haul, particularly the low-cost markets, doing very, very well. The airport side is again a tale of two cities. Those that followed the forecast that issued in January and February and March and hired staff and prepared, they've done very, very well. We've seen good performances in Italy, good performances in France, good performances in Spain. But unfortunately, this is not the case throughout the whole of the network. We've seen chaos and luggage abandoned. We've seen 1.5 kilometre queues. We've seen a mess in Schiphol. We've seen issues in Dublin. We've seen it in Birmingham, in Bristol, in Manchester. But we've also seen it in Palma and in other places that are causing trouble throughout the network. And this is something we did not anticipate. And of course, we have to recognise it does take airports longer to gear up for an immediate return. That's number one. And number two, airports did not benefit from the substantial assistance that was given, that the airlines got from some governments. And it's not a common answer throughout the system, but it is really putting a kind of an anchor on our development going forward. I'm unhappy to tell you that air traffic management delays are back. On the left-hand side there, you can see the whole 2019 situation. And on the right-hand side, you can see June 2022. So we're back to delays. But the problem we're now facing is we're back to the delays with less flights. And why is this? The reason for this is simple. First of all, we have the airport situation, which is causing backup delays. We also have the situation with the Ukraine, where we're diverting traffic south through Romania, through Bulgaria, through the Balkans into Turkey, rather than north via Estonia and the Baltics. So we're seeing that aircraft are now in different places than they would be before. So there's been a shift in the regional pattern away from Poland and pushing more traffic into Germany, into France, where of course we have capacity constraints. And then on top of all this, we have social action, which has been driven by inflation. And last weekend in France, we had social action. So hopefully, we would ask everybody to be respectful and give everybody a chance to have their summer holidays, so that at least then we can keep the network going during July and August. Because July and August are going to be difficult. We're going to see air traffic situation delays. We're looking at congestion in airports. All in all, very difficult. When we now turn to the environment and today's topic, the big announcement of Friday was that the Dutch government wants Amsterdam Airport to shrink. Both of the airport operator, KLM, and the airport have reacted negatively, but the government have announced that from environmental reasons, they're going to put on a new cap of 440k, which is a 13% reduction in what was there beforehand. So basically, they're shrinking the size of Schiphol. Personally, I don't think this is a good idea. I think there would be more enlightened if they put in requirements for, types of SAF to use, less emissions from aircraft, newer aircraft and all that, rather than limit the movements. But look, that's a political decision and it's really up to them. But it's a bad idea, in my view, for aviation. And I'd be really interested to see how Andrew and William discussed it today. But it's going to add prices and cost to the general public. We're committed in Eurocontrol for two things. First of all, I want to say is that we are committed to the net zero emissions by 2050. But remember, aircraft technology is going to take a time to catch up, and we're going to have to try and move towards a hydrogen-based activity. But we will be faced with market-based measures, the emissions trading scheme, CORSIA, because it will take the new technology time to come in. And here in Eurocontrol, we're very conscious of a number of things. First of all, last month we did a calculation of looking at how the Fit for 55 till 2030 would increase costs. And basically, if you're looking at an A320 on a European flight, which is on a 5% max, and you look at ETS and CORSIA taxation, etc., the increase will be 27%. And that will work through very quickly to fares. So excluding the price of oil, excluding the Russian invasion of Ukraine, excluding the recession and inflation, without anything else, you're going to get a 27% increase if nothing happens. Now, if something happens, and what I mean by something is the single European sky, and if we see new aircraft technology, you can drop that back to 17%. So the message is that there is a cost to the consumer of the Fit for 55, and it's important that we realise that. And that cost is going to be the base cost, because on top of that, there will be the normal increases in fuel, return on investment, all of the things that you've got, inflation. So we're looking at kind of a turbulent time in terms of airfares for the next number of years. But we're very proactive when it comes to this in Eurocontrol. And this is one of the reasons we have William debating here with Andrew today. We're really, really proactive in that we want higher SAF uptake beyond the mandatory level. We're very proactive in promoting the ATM modernisation, operational efficiency and single European sky. And we're very much encouraging airlines to have an accelerated fleet upgrade, the advent of electrolyzation, also hybrid aircraft and also hydrogen aircraft. So basically, it's going to be a really exciting debate today. I want to end today's message by reminding everybody that one of Eurocontrol's member states, Ukraine, is in a very difficult situation, having been invaded by the Russian Federation. And Eurocontrol stands in full solidarity with Ukraine, and we will do everything possible we can to help them. They are in our thoughts. So enjoy today's debate.
William, thanks for joining us on Straight Talk.
Great to be here.
This must be our 30th Straight Talk, 28th, 29th Straight Talk. Every single one we've talked about sustainability. So it's probably right that we talk to the people who actually know what they're talking about when we talk about sustainability. I love the name of your organisation, Transport and Environment. It makes it sound like optimistically we can have both.
The idea is we can have both. The the logic and the philosophy of the organization I lead is that the problem is not transport or mobility, the problem is pollution. And that's what we've been fighting for the last 32 years. And if you look at the transport sector as a whole, obviously we're not in a very good place today. The pollution problem, the carbon emissions problem is a big one. But we've been making tremendous progress in some parts of the transport sector, in cars, in trucks. When I joined 11 years ago, none of that was predicted. The situation was pretty hopeless, and now it looks like we can have transport and environment, sustainable mobility in at least some parts of the transport sector. And I think the big challenge, and that's what we'll be talking about today, is how do we get to that place in the aviation sector as well?
How do we get to that place in the aviation sector?
Yeah, that's of course that's a big question. It's good we have a bit of time to talk about that. Maybe let's start with where we are at right now. Aviation accounts for around 5% of Europe's carbon emissions. If you add non-CO2, so contrails to that, you get to perhaps twice the size of that. And aviation emissions have grown rapidly over the last 30, 40 years. And I think the problem with aviation is twofold. One, it's the size of the emissions. 5% is something. But it's also the fact that we don't seem to have the regulations or the tools to bring those emissions down. And as emissions in the power sector, in the car sector, as emissions in the rest of the economy go down, the share of aviation emissions is going to go up, 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 and up. And I think that's what makes environmentalists and regulators and governments very, very nervous. And that's why, maybe some people in the aviation industry think that this sustainability thing is going to go away. It's not going to go away. It's only going to become bigger.
So interestingly, you said we don't have the tools or the means to reduce emissions. I want to talk about both those because I guess by tools you mean regulations. And by means you mean whether it's SAFs or hydrogen or whatever. So let's start with the regulations. Globally, of course, the regulatory format is the ICAO CORSIA scheme. Is that enough? Do you think that's a sufficient tool?
I have pretty strong views about CORSIA. You won't be surprised to hear them. I think CORSIA is really, it's a joke. I can't say anything else. It's we were supposed to have a global deal, a global framework to cut emissions, and what we got instead is a global deal to regulate Europe's emissions through a carbon offsetting scheme that actually doesn't reduce emissions, but just leads to carbon neutral growth. So this global scheme that was supposed to encompass the United States, India, China, Russia. I mean, it's basically Europe and a bunch of other countries, and then some voluntary commitments from airlines. So this is, perhaps not even 10 years ago that wasn't good enough. But after the Paris Agreement, the situation that we were together in Rome, Andrew, it was pretty hot in Rome. It's going to get much, much hotter in Rome in the next 2 weeks. It's going to be 38 degrees. It's a full-on heat wave. And this is the situation in all of Southern Europe right now. We are living the climate crisis. It is not good enough to have a voluntary agreement for offsetting. And I think, as a European, what I find particularly annoying about CORSIA is that, with all this talk about a global deal, but de facto, this is really about preventing Europe from doing something more significant. So I think CORSIA is not what we need. And we can and should talk more about that. I think this goes to what the foundations of what we believe needs to happen in the sector. If you want to have both transport and environment, if you want to have sustainable mobility, we need to change the technology or the fuels that we use. That goes for cars, it goes for trucks, it's for the power sector. It's the same all across the economy. And we're not going to get that through a UN scheme. Imagine we would have asked the United Nations to regulate car pollution. Where would we have gotten?
Yeah. But before we get on to the fuels themselves, in Europe we also have the ETS, of course, the Emission Trading Scheme, which slowly is getting to a place where we put a price on carbon. Is that better than the CORSIA approach?
It is better, yeah. And I think the ETS is broadly a good idea. And I think, the big difference between ETS and CORSIA is the European Emissions Trading Scheme is it's a closed system. It's all European emissions You can't do tree planting to to achieve your goals. You actually have to reduce emissions somewhere in that system. And since 2005, ETS emissions have come down by 35%. It's Europe's main tool in its fight for decarbonization. So yeah, it's a good idea, but I think we also need to acknowledge, as environmentalists, as regulators, that the ETS alone is not going to get us aviation decarbonization, because the kind of carbon prices you would need to force SAF or hydrogen aircraft into the system are just are unimaginable. So it's part of the solution, and it's good that we have it, but it's only part of the solution.
I'd have thought you'd be in favour of higher fares, though. I mean, pushing the fares up on the grounds that would reduce demand. Is that fair?
Yeah, it is. I think we can have higher fares. I think we should have a carbon tax, or we have the ETS, so that's it's almost the same carbon tax. But I think we shouldn't lose sight of our goal. And what is our goal? Our goal is to decarbonize the aviation system, not to tax it. It can be good to tax aviation for various reasons, for fiscal reasons, for environmental reasons, but the goal is to decarbonize the system. And the lesson from, let's say, automotive is that the way you get there is by regulating the sector, by setting clear goals that apply to all the players in the sector. So you have a level playing field, you have good investment certainty, and then you let the companies and the engineers do the work to actually achieve those goals. And I think a carbon price is, it's a good incentive, but it's not actually doing that. It's not actually going to lead to Airbus building hydrogen aircraft, or it's not going to lead to fuel suppliers switching from kerosene, fossil kerosene to biojet or to e-kerosene. For that, the system the ETS was actually not designed for aviation. It was designed to bring down emissions in the power sector, and it's very good at that.
Right. Okay. So the regulation you think we need is regulation that says you must, as a mandate, have X% of your fuel being sustainable by a certain time. And I presume you want that to grow over time.
Yeah, that's right.
And what we have at the moment under what's called the Fit for 55 and the Refuel EU, is that enough, do you think?
It is not enough, Andrew, but it is, it's a massive step forward. I joined this organization 11 years ago. You've been following this for a long time. Consider where we come from. We come from a situation where Europe was not regulating aviation emissions. We come from a situation where most of the airline industry or the aviation industry was saying, oh, we're not really a big part of the problem. In any case, it should be regulated at ICAO. Let's not focus too much on this. We're in a situation now where aviation is one of the central themes of Fit for 55. We have action on emissions trading. We have action on fuels, which is a breakthrough. And the Commission is also starting to look into non-CO2. So I think we've come a long way. And this could be the beginning of something good, but is it sufficient? No, clearly it's not sufficient.
So not sufficient. The current mandate, as I remember it, is 2% by 2025, is that right?
Yeah, and that goes up to 5% in 2030.
Ramping up to... Is 5% enough?
Again, no, it is not enough. You obviously need much more. And let's make a small comparison with another sector. The automotive sector is now being told that it should end the sales of cars with a combustion engine in 2035. Around that time, the aviation sector will have 5-10% SAF in its system. So it is not sufficient. But let's consider where we come from. Again, the automotive sector, we've been regulating it since the 1970s. We're only just getting started with aviation.
Yeah.
And I think what was important for us is that as we promote SAF, or clean jet fuel, that we don't make the mistake of just promoting whatever is available, that we promote the types of fuels that are genuinely sustainable and that you can scale over the long run. So the idea is we go a bit slower in the beginning, but then we scale up fast and we scale up in a sustainable manner.
Right.
So we're okay with the approach the Commission has taken, even though it's
on the grounds that it's one step is better than no steps.
On the grounds that going from 0 to 5% in a quality manner is not that easy. One of the big things we're trying to achieve with the refuel aviation law is to start developing fuels on the basis of hydrogen. So if you look at the fuels question, you've got, on the one hand, you've got biojet. Biojet is available, but it's made from bio wastes or bioproducts like vegetable oils. There's not a lot of bio waste. So if you want to do a lot of this, you need farmland. If you start using farmland, you start competing with food. You start, it starts to lead to deforestation. So, biojet can only play a very small role. The big thing we're trying to achieve with this law is to create critical mass and an industry and a supply chain around hydrogen fuels. These are so-called, power to liquid fuels or e-kerosene. And this is, in principle, this is maybe not infinitely, but this is very scalable.
Right. So, but to do that, what do you need? You need renewable power and you need water. Is that right?
You need renewable power, you need electrolyzers, and you need a source of carbon, which initially you can take from factories, but ultimately, if you want to go to a zero-emission system, you need to start taking it out of the air. So this is, don't get me wrong, this is not an easy solution. It would be much easier if we could fit batteries into airplanes, but we can't do that. Yeah. So this is the second best, and it would allow us to fly in a clean manner.
Right. So just coming back to SAFs, what I think of as SAFs, what you're calling biofuels, if you like. The big concern is in the short term, there's just not very much of it, is there? And as you say, the risk is as I famously once said, SAFs don't grow on trees, when of course actually they do, but or they can. But at the moment, all the SAFs on Earth wouldn't sustain Lufthansa for 4 days. That's a huge problem, isn't it, in the short term?
Yeah, and it also proves my point that in this sector, if you want to get the aviation industry and the fuel suppliers and the whole system to start investing into a different technology or a different fuel, you need something different than you need something other than just commitments. These are very big investments. SAFs are going to be more expensive than kerosene, which is crude oil, refined. It's very easy products. So for that you need regulation, and we haven't had regulation, which is why there isn't a lot of SAF on the market. Right. And that's why we're okay with going slow in the next couple of years and then going faster once we've got the supply, once we've built the supply chains, and once we can ramp up.
But to come back to your point that you made earlier, you think it's only by having sensible and predictable regulations that we'll be able to encourage investment.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. That is the lesson from regulation in the entire economy, in the transport sector. If you're an incumbent company, you're a fuel supplier, you're an oil company, your business model is going to Saudi Arabia or Africa and getting oil out of the ground, putting it on a tanker and refining it in Europe and selling it to Lufthansa. Why on earth would you change to a model where you take green electrons, turn it into hydrogen, turn it into power to liquids, and then sell it to Lufthansa? If that is more expensive, as an incumbent, you're making a lot of money. Why would you do that? The only reason you're going to do that is because you have to, and all your competitors are doing it. And that's what we call a level playing field. And yeah, it's perhaps it sounds heavy-handed, but the lesson of all the work on the power sector, on the automotive sector, is that actually once this gets going, it can go very fast. You get a lot of innovation, the price comes down, and actually the companies get behind it as well. Right now, even Volkswagen is no longer resisting electrification. I think we're going to see something similar in the aviation sector.
Right, but in cars, the breakthrough really was Tesla, wasn't it? Realistically, in terms of sending the number of e-cars in the market up to really quite substantial percentages. Of course, it's easy for Tesla. All they had to do was put wheels on a computer, whereas it's quite hard for Volkswagen because they've got to re-engineer everything sort of inside out. Is there a Tesla in the SAFs market? Is there a Tesla waiting to come out and be disruptive and be a competitor?
Let's ask the question differently. How did Tesla come about? Tesla didn't, Elon Musk, he wasn't operating in a void, right? He was working in California, one of the most progressive states in the world, that had been mandating car makers to sell electric cars for a very long time. And so he came into that market, and he was certain that somebody was going to buy these cars because there was a law requiring car makers to sell those vehicles. So in the first years of his business, most of the money he was making, if ever he made a profit in the beginning, he was making it by selling credits to other car makers. And this is the kind of regulation that we need. It doesn't have to be BP or Shell that delivers the fuels. It can be new entrants, but we need to create a system in which those new entrants can actually, are certain that in the next 5 to 10 years, there's going to be a market for their product.
Yeah, but again, to just stick with that analogy for a moment longer, probably the only industry harder to break into and disrupt than the car manufacturers, one would have thought, would be the oil manufacturers or the oil companies. So is there a Tesla in the fuel area that could break in and disrupt? Or are we stuck at the mercy of BP and Shell and so on?
Well, what you're seeing right now is the development of a hydrogen economy. Hydrogen economy that's going to be largely based on green electrons, on renewables. That's what Europe wants. So there's a whole bunch of new companies entering that space. The oil majors are also entering that space, but there is no reason why all these hydrogen producers, could not at some point also go into the aviation market or in the aviation fuels market. And I think what's interesting is if you look at the hydrogen economy, one of the few guaranteed markets in Europe is going to be the aviation market. Actually, thanks to that regulation.
Yeah, right. Okay. So Airbus is proposing a hydrogen aeroplane prototype anyway, or even entry into service of a 100-seat aeroplane by about 2035. But at the moment anyway, that looks like it's using hydrogen as a gas rather than hydrogen as a liquid. It's going to be a blended wing. It's going to have enormous fuel tanks. Are you optimistic about that?
I'm in two minds about it. I think on the one hand, I am optimistic because it would be it is good to hear the biggest aircraft manufacturer in the world say that they're going to develop a new technology. That's good, it sends a signal, creates hooks for us to then hold them accountable. And it would be a much better solution because what you do with the power to liquid fuels is you turn those power to liquid fuels, you turn hydrogen into a power to liquid and then you burn it in an engine. It would actually be much better to just use the hydrogen in a plane, much more efficient. I am slightly skeptical of what Airbus is doing because again, you've got an incumbent that is incredibly successful. They're making so much money selling, the aircrafts they've been selling for 20, 30 years, with some incremental improvements.
That's a little bit harsh. I mean, I think they've really quite substantial improvements in efficiency.
Yeah.
25% is the fact that we've made it from A to K rather than Z, I accept, means we're still short. But my point remains, the change in aviation, the efficiency in aviation, driven by cost concerns rather than sustainability, although, they're just very helpful bedfellows, has been really quite remarkable. And I think the airline industry doesn't get as much credit for that as perhaps it ought to get. You don't agree? You disagree?
Look, we recognize that there's a new aircraft type around every 20 years, right? And then every 20 years it becomes 20 or 25% more efficient. And some of that is efficiency improvement. Some of that is, getting more people into that plane. So that's good. And we recognize that. But this is still incremental progress. It is, making your plane a bit more aerodynamic, your engine a bit better, etc. That's incremental progress. Betting the company on a completely different fuel, a completely different powertrain, that is disruptive.
Sure.
And why would Airbus do that? Why would you? If you were Airbus, why would you do that?
Because it may mean that you continue to sell aeroplanes, because going forward there's every chance fuel-based aeroplanes just won't sell, or the enormous issues of turning hydrogen into a liquid fuel that can drop in just becomes impossible to sustain. I don't know. I mean, I may not bet the company, but I'd be prepared to bet half the company, I think.
Yeah? Okay.
Yeah. That was the impression I've always got from Airbus as well, that they're... I hear your cynicism.
No, it's not cynicism. It is just, you're the CEO of a company, you're responsible for lots and lots of employees, you're responsible towards your shareholders. At some point, somebody comes up to you and says, let's invest 10, 20, 30 billion into development of something completely new. If it works, great, but there's so much risk. If it doesn't work, well, you might just have bankrupted a company.
But we come back then to the point about regulation, don't we? Because at Volkswagen, they've effectively now bet the company. They've had to go into electrification, but that's because there's a regulation that says that's what they have to do.
Exactly. And I think we need to come to a situation where, and I'd be interested to talk to Airbus about, what type of framework would make it easier for your CEO to say yes to this project. And I think one of the things we need to create small guaranteed markets. So are there going to be places in Europe where you can only fly zero emission aircraft in, let's say, 2035 or 2040? Can we start designating those routes? And that would, then if you're Airbus, you're the only company that is working on this, or one of the only companies, then it actually guarantees a business for you. So it becomes a bit more attractive. And then there's a lot of other things you can do with incentives and regulations.
But in the meantime, we've got regulations outlawing flights under 500 kilometres if there's a train available. They're the sorts of short-haul flights that we should, in the short term, be encouraging for this sort of development.
What's interesting about the French example, if I'm not mistaken, the ban on the short-haul flight in France actually has an exemption for zero-emission aircraft.
Well, okay.
Which I think is very smart and very interesting.
Right. I hadn't appreciated that either. Let me change topics a little bit. Non-CO2 emissions. As recently as 2 or 3 weeks ago, the A4E said it's a bit premature to start worrying about non-CO2 emissions. Do you agree with that?
I don't, and I think it's a knee-jerk reaction. And I understand where it comes from. If you're a corporate lobbyist, somebody says, "Oh, there's a problem," your reaction is sort of automatically, "Oh no, it's not a problem. Let's study it a bit more. Let's not do anything because it might lead to taxes or it might lead to regulation." But on the core of the issue, we've known for a very long time that non-CO2 is a problem since 1999. The only question was, how big a problem is it, and what can we do about it? Over the last couple of years, we've gotten answers to those two questions.
So how big a problem is it?
Well, roughly, if aviation carbon emissions are 5%, if you add the contrails, it's double the size. So
is non-CO2 emissions just contrails?
No, it's other things as well. But contrails are the most significant of that, and they're the sort of the evidence is the clearest. So I think it's right to focus on contrails. And if you look at the evidence that is emerging, there's two things you can do to avoid contrail formation, and one is you clean up the fuel, because what happens is you have exhaust in certain parts of the atmosphere. You have these particles, they combine with ice particles, and that creates the contrails. So actually, if we can reduce the number of particles in the fuel, if we can reduce the aromatics of the fuel, we can also reduce the contrail formation. This is fuel quality stuff. We've been regulating fuel quality, getting rid of sulfur and lead and stuff for 40 years. This is not rocket science. Actually, it's a lot easier than producing power to liquids. So I think, let's.
But again, it's in aviation, we regulate it through ICAO.
We think we could also regulate this at European level.
Right. Which shouldn't. Well, will that have a cost impact? Will we yet again hear screams that we've made the aviation industry in Europe uncompetitive?
Yeah, it might have a cost impact, but you're talking about improving a refining process. You're not talking about doubling the cost of aviation fuel. So that's why I think it's a knee-jerk reaction. I think we should, together with the airlines and the aviation industry, look at the solutions, look at what they cost, look at their benefits, and I think if we do that, we will find that non-CO2 is not this complex, intractable problem, but actually might be one of the low-hanging fruits. Because the other thing you can do is actually you can reroute a very small number of flights to avoid those parts of the atmosphere where you create the contrails. You need very advanced weather forecasting for that, but it's not rocket science. It's doable. And if you're talking about fuel quality and rerouting 2-3% of flights to avoid 60-70% of contrails, which is that's the other half of the aviation climate problem, I think that might actually be one of the simpler things we can do. So I would really invite A4E and the rest of the aviation industry to look at this differently. And I can tell the aviation industry that for me, this is not about imposing a tax, because that's what it was in the past, right? It was there was this idea that we have an additional levy in the ETS for non-CO2 emissions. I'm interested in solving the problem. So
you've segued very beautifully, though, into a couple of other topics I'd like to explore with you. The first one is, what's your relationship with the airlines? As a matter of fact, IATA, A4E, the others.
I don't know. It varies. I have a lot of sympathy for Michael O'Leary when he says that it's a disgrace that the incumbents and the legacy carriers are excluded from the ETS. And I would be, I'd be happy to go on stage with him and say that together with him.
Yeah.
At the same time, we talk a lot to Lufthansa and other airlines about SAFs, and they've got good commitments on that. And we're working together with the airlines on some of those regulations. I think their position has markedly improved. So, I'd say it's okay. All things considered.
Okay, so then the other half, perhaps, of that question: do you think we have too much flying? Do you think too many people fly?
The answer to that question can only be yes. And you could ask the same question about driving, about meat consumption, about ordering stuff on Amazon. As long as we haven't cleaned up the supply chains and we haven't gotten rid of the carbon emissions in all those products and processes, we consume too much of it. And so, yes, that also goes for aviation.
Right. So would you back a ticket tax, for example, to try to reduce the demand?
Let me first say that I think we as environmentalists and regulators in the community, we need to ask not that question. We need to ask, what do we need to do to make flying sustainable? Because if you ask the question, is there too much flying? The answer is yes. And then we should go and talk to individual people about their summer holidays, whereas actually individual people have no power over the tools that we were talking about in the beginning. What power do they have over multi-billion euro investments in SAF and new aircraft? We need to talk to the people that have the power.
But that sort of takes us to an interesting dilemma, doesn't it? The more people that we can get flying, the more chance there is we get the investments to influence these multi-billion dollar investments in fuel and new aircraft types and so forth. But at the same time, the more people that fly, to get to the point where you've got the finances to make those investments, we're going to be making it worse in the short term.
I don't know whether that's necessarily true. I think if you look at the type of people that fly globally, it's the wealthiest part of the global population. And that is also true in more developed markets like the US or Europe. It's rich people that fly, and they fly most. So it is possible to make for those people to pay a bit more.
So maybe a frequent flyer tax or something like that.
Yeah, in principle, that's a good idea. It's there's some issues with the implementation, but in principle, the idea that if you fly a lot, then you're probably a well-off person, or you're working for a company, then you should pay a bit more, and part of that money should be used to clean up the sector. Yeah, I think that's fair.
Are you seeing companies being more proactive about ensuring that their carbon footprint as an organisation has come down? Do you think that'll have an impact on flying and flying profiles, things like that?
Yeah, I think so. I think this is actually going to be one of the big changes in the next couple of years. We've seen with the pandemic that we can do business without getting on an airplane all of the time. And I've got a lot of friends that work in business, that work in banks. Things have changed. Things have changed because of cost, because of lower availability of flights, but also because of more pressure on sustainability. And so companies are going to be obliged to report on their carbon emissions. And for a lot of companies, their flights are going to be a significant share of their emissions. And so there's going to be a lot of pressure on those guys to cut back on that. And so I think business travel is not going to return to what it was in 2019. And that's going to be a big change.
It's ironic that the flight shaming that actually works eventually comes from the corporate side, not from the individual side.
Yeah. But there's a lot of, and I find that interesting as an environmentalist. there's a lot of power in these corporations. They are big buyers. They have clout with the airlines. That's why companies like Air France, like Lufthansa, why they're getting more serious about sustainability, because their corporate customers are demanding it. And if they don't provide solutions, their corporate customers are going to back out of the system.
Yeah,
and that's going to be a big problem for them.
Yeah. Do you talk to the big corporations? Have you got a good relationship with some of those sorts of classical aviation ticket buyers?
We've done something recently that is a start of creating that relationship. We did a ranking where we looked at lots of big European corporations in key European countries and looked at their aviation, at their travel policy. And we ranked them, and we found that a couple of them are doing really well, but a lot of them don't have a policy yet, or they don't report. And what was amazing is how much feedback we've gotten when we published that. So this is really a big topic inside those companies. Yeah, and I think if I were the airlines, I would be worried about that.
Yeah, right. No, for sure. Which brings me to my last question. This is a standard question I always ask: is what role do you think EUROCONTROL can play in this ongoing sustainability discussion?
I think EUROCONTROL has played a positive role in the debate around non-CO2. I think they've shown a big interest in that, and I really would appreciate EUROCONTROL continuing to play that role, bringing people together, bringing the scientists together with the companies, and trying to get us to a place where we can talk about what are the solutions to this problem, what are the costs, what are the benefits, and how can we make this happen. And the other thing is, I'll just keep sharing those data. EUROCONTROL has all those data. I think what we appreciate about EUROCONTROL data is that it shows how big a problem long haul flights are. Because it's a bit of a personal frustration, but we have these national debates where everybody seems to think that if we have a ticket tax on short haul flights, we solve the aviation climate problem. But this is absolutely false.
Yeah,
absolutely false. It's a long haul problem.
Right, it's a long one. Well, obviously, as someone who comes from Australia, I'm not all that pleased to hear that.
Yeah, but that's pretty. I mean, it's logical. It's long distance, a lot of fuel burn. That's where the biggest impact is.
Well, indeed, you've got to burn more fuel to get there.
Yeah.
William, thank you so much for your time. I don't know about you, ladies and gentlemen, but I thought absolutely fascinating. No flag burning, no anything like that. Just a sensible discussion about how we can find solutions. Thanks for joining us. I look forward to seeing you again very soon, and I wish you all a very good day.